There's a phrase that we use very often in our era, and that phrase is that we live in the greatest era of change, technological change ever. Unprecedented change. And I'd like to start off by fundamentally challenging that assertion. There's a fundamental flaw in that saying and in that belief, because unless you possess a time travel machine or you are a vampire, this is the only era that you have ever lived. So you have bad data. In order to make that claim, you have to know something about other eras. And very few of the people who make that claim know anything about the history of technology. So I'm going to start you off in my tales for you. I'm a storyteller. I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories that will help you understand creative thinking and to help you be more creative and a better problem solver. I'm going to take you back to 1884. 1884 is a fascinating year to examine from this premise about technological change. This is an era when if you were someone who wanted to be an entrepreneur, you wanted to be an innovator, you wanted to make something great happen through technology, you'd be working in fields like railroads, telegraphs, telephone, phonograph. If you were born or you grew up in 1884, you had no indoor plumbing. You had no electric lights. That is the time when all these things started to become important and powerful. Now, in 1884, there were two young men in this era who were young, entrepreneurial engineering types. If they were alive today, they would probably be startup founders and start a company. But back then, what they were into was construction. That was the cutting edge. How do you build buildings? How do you engineer railroads? How do you make buildings that are taller than 5 stories high? So there were two young men, Koechlin and Nouget. They were architects and engineers. They worked for a small firm, and they had a proposal for a grand idea that would change the world. Their proposal was to build the largest building that had ever been built in the world, and to build it out of a material that was relatively new, a technique of using iron called wrought iron. Now, as I offered this challenge to this fundamental premise about how our era is supposedly unique. But these two young men, the way they went about proposing their ideas is very similar to how we would do it today. We like to believe that mock-ups and prototyping and iterative design, those things are something modern, but those were things that go back all the way through history. So they had this idea and they pitched their boss on it and they made a proposal in a mock-up that looked like this. Now, by showing you this, I am giving away something about what the project actually is. And yes, your assumption is right. Their boss was named Eiffel. He was not famous yet. He was a successful architect. He had an architecture firm, but he had no buildings that had his name on them yet. So they pitched him on the idea for the tower, which looked like this. Now, one thing you should notice about this drawing, this mock-up, is they were pitching their boss. They did something fairly good when it comes to pitching ideas. If you look in the margin on the right side of the page, on the right side of their drawing, I'm going to zoom this in so you can see it better, they made a little legend for their boss, Mr. Eiffel. They were showing him 7 of the largest and most famous buildings in the world at that time. So at the bottom, you can see it's Notre Dame, Statue of Liberty, and maybe you can recognize a few of the others. Now, the second building, the Statue of Liberty, happened to be a building that Eiffel himself had worked on. So they were trolling their boss a little bit. They were saying, hey, Eiffel, this will be 7 times grander than this thing you already made, which was pretty clever. Now, it turns out that the pitch was a failure, in part because Eiffel thought the idea of the tallest building in the world was to use data and experimental data terminology was a vanity metric. Having the tallest building in the world didn't mean that much to him. He wanted the building to actually solve a problem. It should do something. Technology should not be done just for stunt purposes. It should do something or mean something or at least be beautiful to look at so it could inspire people. So the pitch was rejected. But Eiffel told them, don't just kill the idea. He gave them that feedback, said it had to have more. It can't just be tall. It has to do something else. So these two young men decided, yeah, okay, we're not going to kill the idea. We'll see if we can come up with a better proposal. They got a third engineer involved, someone with more experience than they had, someone who also had a master level skill in aesthetics and thinking about how to make things beautiful. understanding proportion and the golden ratio. That's where the styling of the Eiffel Tower that makes it such a wonderful building came from. They basically collaborated with someone with an expertise and skill set that they did not possess. Before I finish the story, there's 3 lessons in here about creative thinking that are important that I want to call it, and there are many lessons. The first one is that the pitch matters as much as the idea. If you're an expert on something and you have an insight that other people don't have, when you pitch the idea, you have all these assumptions about why the idea is good, but the person listening to you does not. If you can't express your insight in a way that they can understand, your idea will go nowhere. And one of the great parts of history of innovation and invention are frustrated inventors who can't understand why their ideas never go anywhere. And that's why. They believe there should be some universal understanding of what a good idea is, and I'm here to tell you that there isn't. Persuasion is half of the problem to solve in getting a new idea supported. Second, you often need diverse talents to make a breakthrough happen. These 2 young men had a grand idea, but it wasn't sophisticated enough to meet their sponsor or their stakeholders' criteria. And they took that feedback to heart. They realized, you know what, to do this to Eiffel's satisfaction, we need to get someone involved that has expertise that we don't possess. And many people who are experts are arrogant about their expertise and ignorant about other kinds of expertise. The perennial one is the one that happened here, about aesthetics and about engineering. And they were smart enough to bring those 2 things together. Third is that management, if they want creative ideas, should tend to critique rather than to kill. Critiquing an idea teaches something to the pitcher, teaches something to the creator, gives them an insight, a better understanding of what the real goals are. So the next time they work on a project, they'll have a better aim at what they're actually after. Now, as you all know, I'm sure, the Eiffel Tower was eventually, the proposal was accepted. Eiffel went to the Paris Commission and built the building for the World's Fair, and it's now one of the most famous buildings in the world. So yay, Eiffel Tower, it exists, and it survived this whole process. So I have 4 stories for you, 4 lessons for you, rather, that should bring to you a better understanding of how to work with ideas. And those 3 mini ones fit in to this first one, which is that all ideas are made of other ideas. All ideas are made of other ideas. Now, when I say all ideas are made from other ideas, all of you are, I'm assuming, are well-educated, you're smart, you've been trained in science and mathematics and engineering, and the basic way that we tend to teach people is you first learn a small premise, arithmetic, and then you learn the next premise. It's more sophisticated, but built on the first premise, multiplication, and on you go. So we have a natural sense, okay, yes, all ideas are made of other ideas. But that's not how I mean this phrase to be used. This phrase is a phrase that can be useful to you. This little mantra can be useful to you when you are stuck. You're working on a problem you're trying to solve. You've tried one approach, 2 approaches. You feel like there's no more approaches to try. That's when you need to remember this phrase. Because if all ideas are made of other ideas and you have some prototype you're working with that isn't working, it means you can take that prototype and redivide it into the component ideas that put it together. And once you redivide it into smaller parts, you now have other alternatives to try. What if I take this sub-idea and I move it over here? What if I take this idea out and I take another idea and put it in? What could my next prototype then be? And what usually happens after you've been working on a project for a while, you feel stuck. You feel like you've tried all the alternatives. You tried all the reasonable options. But that is never true. So I'd like to ask you to indulge me. I'm going to ask you to say this mantra. I'll go 1, 2, 3, and you go, all ideas are made from other ideas. Are you ready? Okay, 1, 2, 3. All ideas are made from other ideas. Fantastic. We have a creativity cult here in the room. Lovely. Let's try another one. I am unique just like everyone else. Oh, you don't like that one. I got one more for you. I put the A in A-B testing. Let's try that. I put the A in A-B testing. That really should be a t-shirt. I haven't seen anyone wear any experimental A-B testing jokes on their t-shirts. Okay, so let's talk about this. I'm going to bring you back to the story of the Eiffel Tower to flesh this out and explain more about what I mean by this idea. So the only building that most of the world knows that was made by Eiffel is the Eiffel Tower. One of the most famous buildings in the world. It's not a surprise, most people don't know. But every great creator, inventor, whoever your heroes are in science or in the arts, in music, whoever your heroes are creatively. Most of the works you know are probably their famous ones. Those are the ones that make it in the museum and get written up in Wikipedia. But every creator has a long history of prior projects that helped them to learn what they needed to learn to make the thing that became famous. So this is one of Eiffel's first buildings. It's a railroad bridge, which sounds very ordinary to us today, but in the era, in the time, this was relatively new. Railroads were not that old yet. Bridges of this scale were relatively new and they were kind of scary. But looking at this bridge, given the context of the Eiffel Tower, it's not that interesting to look at. The construction technique here is a very old one called box and girder construction. And you can see wood bridges that are far older than this one that use that technique. So he started off by doing simple constructions, using simple ideas that would never become famous. Eiffel also knew about some other ideas regarding towers. This is from an earlier World's Fair than the one that the Eiffel Tower was built for. This is from the New York World's Fair in the 1850s. And he knew about this building, he knew about its characteristics and found it interesting, but his critique of this building echoes the critique he had for the two young engineers who pitched him on the Eiffel Tower. That's what seeded his critique, was his awareness of this other idea. He wrote a review of this in his journals that basically said, it's impressively, I'm paraphrasing here, it's impressively engineered, but serves no real purpose. It's purely, I'm paraphrasing, it's purely a stunt. It doesn't actually do anything, which mirrors the feedback he then, because he knew about this idea, he gave to those two young engineers that led us towards the Eiffel Tower. Where this gets much more interesting, this is a later bridge that Eiffel built, I think in 1884. Around the time that the Eiffel Tower project was being proposed, this bridge was being finished. Now, this bridge is far more interesting to look at. This is where the notion of ideas being made from other ideas gets very powerful. Because what's going on here is a combination of several different ideas. One, railroad bridge. There had already been railroad bridges, and Eiffel had built a few of them. That's idea number one. Two, the arch. Now, the arch is one of the oldest design patterns in the history of architecture and engineering. There are stone buildings still standing today made from arches that are 2,000 or more years old. So you have an arch here. The third idea, which is the relatively new one that Eiffel was working with, was iron. And iron had characteristics for engineering that were far more powerful or better than previous other materials. The strength and tension ratios that iron could withstand are very different. And that's what allowed him to make an arch that was basically transparent. And you have to imagine with the eyes of someone in 1884 who had probably never even seen a bridge at this height, railroads are still relatively new, who looked at this for the first time, it would have seemed like something from a science fiction novel, that the bridge is just floating in space. They were probably scared and intimidated. How could something so thin, the air goes through it, hold up a railroad crossing? So the combination of those three things, those three ideas, is what led to this. As you can tell, of course, those beautiful arches and curves are echoed in the design and characteristics of the Eiffel Tower. This notion of ideas being made of other ideas is not unique to engineering. It's simply the way that ideas work. So many of you may be familiar with this drawing. Does anyone here know the name of this drawing? You have to be louder because it's a big room. Vitruvian Man. So when I heard that this drawing was called Vitruvian Man, I just assumed Vitruvian, that must be the name of the dude in the drawing, like he was the model, or maybe that was like Eiffel's friend who posed for it or something. And that's completely wrong. That's Vitruvian is a reference to a Roman architect named Vitruvius, who wrote a book in the 1st century that documented patterns, design patterns for architecture and engineering. We like to think design patterns is something the software engineering world invented. Not true. This is probably the oldest, at least in the Western canon, the oldest reference book for understanding design patterns documented that can be reused. It's obviously not about software, but the whole notion of collecting design patterns for reuse is an old one. Now, the story that's in this book that led Da Vinci to want to make that drawing, this book collected design patterns that Vitruvius knew that he had collected from the Greeks and his own peers as Roman architects. So for 200 or 300 years before Vitruvius lived, there were these design patterns that were known and were used. And he documented those. 1,500 years go by. Da Vinci is interested in understanding how things work. He reads this book. There's a passage in the book that talks about proportion. It talks about how to be the ideal aesthetic for a human, how wide should your arms be relative to how tall you are, and the size of your head relative to the length of your legs. There's a whole page, a whole chapter about this that he wrote about proportion. And Da Vinci read this and was inspired by it and said, I want to make a drawing that illustrates that idea. And that's what this is. Now, Da Vinci, his popularity was not that great in the 1800s and 1900s. His popularity soared in a very ironic and backward kind of story. The Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre. And when it was stolen, it became far more famous than it ever was when it was there. People used to go to the Louvre to see the empty spot where the Mona Lisa had been. Human psychology is very strange, as many of you know, given how many experiments you run. But the reason why Da Vinci is so famous in modern times, far more famous than he ever was when he was alive, was because of that. And so this drawing now is one of the most well-known, recognizable drawings in the world today in modern times. So people really don't know anything about its history or its origins or its meaning. It's simply now a meme. A meme usually has lost its context, which means, though, that memes are something creators like to play with. And you don't need much back knowledge or history knowledge to play with memes, which means you see things like this. This is also ideas being made of other ideas, being combined in a certain way. But whenever you see this, you know, oh, this is a joke reference to this, but not really knowing anything about it. And you can find dozens and dozens of variations of this, which I think is fun and playful. But what I'm trying to teach you here is that these are very shallow. Playing with memes in this way doesn't actually convey anything of depth. You're going across the surface by referencing things. A much more interesting use of the understanding of ideas being made from other ideas is this use of Vitruvian Man. Now, many of you probably watched the show Westworld. For those of you who don't watch the show, Westworld's a science fiction story questioning the idea of what is the true nature of man, and can man be replicated through artificial intelligence of robots. So the use of Vitruvian Man here is very, very potent. This is echoing back through a long stretch of history, this question of what is true, what is good, what is proportion. And that is where the power of this notion of ideas being made from other ideas comes from. Now, to spin this in a more productive way, and I'm going to give you some examples that are not quite so old. By studying the history of a problem that you are trying to solve, you will discover new ways to solve it that other people probably won't find. The Westworld creators knew a little bit more about Vitruvian Man, and that's what allowed them to use that meme in a very powerful way. Study the history of a problem. That sounds strange. Studying the history of a problem is not usually what you're told to do. You're usually told to solve a problem. But every problem that anyone works on today, any engineering problem, any design problem, has a history. Other people have tried to solve it. Some of the solutions from the past or the hypotheses from the past that have value and are useful are often abandoned. But if you take the time to study the history of the problem you are working on, you will have insights and discoveries that your competitors do not. As an example, this is the Wikipedia image that tries to explain the Google PageRank algorithm. Google, boo, boo. PageRank algorithm. Now, Larry and Sergey, the founders of Google, they were grad students at Stanford, and they were aware, and the PageRank algorithm, just to frame this up properly, the PageRank algorithm is based on the idea that you can verify or judge the value of one page by how many other pages point to it. That's the basic idea. That's why their search results for the first Google search engine were so much better, because they were using that idea. Now, that idea has a history. That history is about academic papers. In the 1950s, the same technique, or actually not the same, the original use of this technique was used for academic research papers. And many are nodding your heads, plus some masters and PhD people in the room. But one paper, you can, well, what paper, how many papers are referencing this one paper, paper A? How many other papers reference it? That tells me something about the value of this paper. So that had been around for a long time, and Larry and Sergey knew about that idea, as did their advisors. So they took this idea that was very old and well understood from one domain and brought it into another domain, the web. And that's what allowed Google to have a better search result. Amazon's called the everything store. How many of you have a Prime membership? Amazon Prime membership? Almost everyone in the room. Okay. If you read this letterhead, which is from about 1905, for those of you who don't know, Sears has this nice little echo. Amazon is an echoing of Sears, and that Sears saw how the world was changing. Railroads were changing how things could be delivered. Printing had changed, so there was a way to put a catalog together of all the items you could possibly warehouse or source. And they combined those two things together. That in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, there was a catalog that existed that you could have shipped to you anywhere in the U.S. that railroads went to that let you order almost anything, from equipment to build a house to stuff to put in the house. You could literally buy a kit to build a house, actually. There was a page, not a page, it's an Amazon reference. You could literally go and buy a house, a kit for a house that would be delivered to you by a railroad, including a service option where workers would come and actually build the house for you. So if you read this letterhead, which is I think from 1903, it's basically the Amazon Prime business model. We sell everything by mail order only. No brick and mortar. Mail order only. Your money promptly returned, which is Amazon Prime's service promise. If you're not perfectly satisfied, we will pay freight or express charges that go both ways. The Amazon catalog, many of you probably do experiments or help groups do experiments on landing pages. Landing pages are the equivalent of catalog pages. Those catalogs have the same challenges. How do I offer the prices for this object on this page in a way that anchors the pricing? They had all the same problems that Amazon has today on their landing pages, but they had it in the form of a catalog instead. And the same thing is also true about there always being a history for the kind of experiments that many of you do, the history of data science. And so I went back and looked and tried to find what was the first example of someone doing A/B testing. The first example I could find was Al-Razi, who was a polymath. He worked on many different fields. The specific thing that he A/B tested was they knew about meningitis, and they were trying to figure out whether bloodletting would help cure meningitis. So he did an A/B test where he had more than one patient. He gave one patient bloodletting, one patient not, and saw the results. Of course, the fundamental failure here is that both A and B were bad. Bloodletting, not so good. And they wouldn't figure that out for like another 2,000 years, or another 1,500 years. So there's that. Now, James Lind is given the reputation for doing, he's often in the West given credit for the first A/B tests. But there's older history, obviously, that I just showed you. But what he deserves credit for, in trying to solve the problem of scurvy, he did the first multivariate testing, where he was doing 5 or 6 different possible solutions to solve the problem of scurvy on a certain trip. Pairs of sailors were given different supplements to see if that would help or not. They did discover initially that vitamin C, or their approximation of vitamin C, which was citrus fruit, did have some positive value, but it would take another set of decades before that information was validated enough that it became part of the standard protocol in the West for how to prevent people from getting scurvy. Now, my second big lesson for you is about our hubris. And I offered you some hubris at the beginning. This notion that we live in the greatest era of change that has ever happened in the world. That's hubris, because we're talking about the present. A different kind of hubris, though, comes back to expertise. And that by the time you have gone to college, and you've been a professional, you're working in your job, most people, by the time they are in your situation, believe that you are good at recognizing good ideas and bad ideas. That's how you've gotten here. That's how you get good reviews, good ideas and bad ideas. A flaw in that confidence is about real kinds of progress, creative kinds of progress. Most of the most interesting ideas you're going to come across are probably going to seem weird to you when you first see them. You have a framework for doing those evaluations of good and bad. When you have an idea come along that changes the paradigm for how you evaluate ideas, is going to move us from one framework to another, that evaluation system doesn't work as well. We tend to confuse weird ideas with bad ideas, and they're not the same thing. So to help illustrate this, I'm going to go back to the Eiffel Tower story. I gave you the really short version of it. I'm going to give you a slightly longer version of it. So when I left you off in the Eiffel Tower story, give the quick rewind. They pitched Eiffel. He said no. Got more people involved. Got a better design. Pitched him again. He said yes. And hallelujah. Yay, Paris, Eiffel Tower. The part of the story I didn't tell you, though, his team's acceptance and his approval was not sufficient. He had to go to the Paris World's Fair group and convince them. He knew them pretty well. He's famous enough in Paris. They said, yes, but we'll only give you half the budget that you wanted. Eiffel took this as an opportunity. He was not just an engineer and an architect. He was an entrepreneur. He said, fine, I'll put up the money as long as I get the returns. So his entrepreneurial mindset and his willingness to put up his own money that allowed that idea to go through. He had personal stake in his idea. I mentioned pitching earlier on. One major flaw in creative thinking and developing new ideas is when you pitch an idea and you're not willing to put anything of yourself behind it. Not your money, not your time, not your reputation, not your weekends. Often you need leverage to convince people of the merit of an idea. And so he was willing to do that behind the Eiffel Tower. He said, this is important enough and interesting enough, and I believe in it enough, I will put my own fortune at stake. The next problem he had, though, was far more surprising. Fine, he put his money up, they got a team together, they started construction. They start building the Eiffel Tower for the World's Fair. Immediately, the elite class in Paris is outraged. Artists, engineers, musicians, poets, politicians, all the people who are the high-minded leaders of the culture come out against it. And not only do they come out against it, they collaborate together to write a pamphlet. And it was written by what they called the Committee of 300. They wrote a pamphlet, which was the blogging and social media of the day, to come out and say, this project should be killed. I'm going to read you a snippet from this pamphlet. We writers, painters, sculptors, architects protest with all of our strength, with all of our indignation in the name of slighted French taste, which is a powerful force, against the erection of this useless and monstrous Eiffel Tower. This mast of iron gymnasium apparatus, incomplete, confused, and deformed. Now, Randy mentioned I'm a former Microsoft PM and lead PM, and I've had many product reviews at this company to executives or teams of people, and I've had lots of them not go so well. But I never had 300 of my peers get together to write a document for a project I hadn't finished yet that just started work on to say, kill the whole thing. That's what this was. Now, we look at this today, the Eiffel Tower is just the most romantic, most beautiful building in the world, or one of them anyway, and this seems absurd. These people were so lost. They were so misguided. How could they be so wrong? And that's where the fallacy about retrospection and history comes into play, because we know too much. You have to imagine you were alive in 1888. Now, in 1888, as I alluded to at the beginning, 1888, there's no steel towers, there's no skyscrapers. That's breakthrough innovation that may or may not work out. Most of Paris is 5-story, 6-story buildings, and they're all built out of normal, ordinary materials, wood and stone. You have a few buildings that are taller, some churches, but those are exceptions. So for the most part, the scale of the city is human. So you have to imagine you're walking down a boulevard. It's a beautiful spring day, and you're with a friend, and you have some wine and a baguette, and you're strolling along, and maybe you have some wine, and a mime strolls by, doing the mime thing. And then you turn the corner, and you see this. Yes, it would seem monstrous. To your sensibility of what good is, this feels really bad. This is really strange. You will have never seen anything like this before in your life. And of course, it's unfinished as well. So the whole power, the third engineer who came along and gave this grace to the building, you can't really appreciate that yet because it looks like a gymnasium apparatus. Bad and weird, not the same thing. Eiffel was smart as a manager. He did another noble thing that good managers should do when pursuing new ideas. He let himself be the lightning rod for all of that criticism. Everyone made fun of him. Cartoons were made about him. They criticized him in papers while his team did the work. He was an engineer. He knew exactly how long it would take to build this, which is not that long, just a few months. So while everyone was yelling at him and saying how terrible it was, he just took all the blame and deflected it so his team could keep working. And that's what good managers and leaders do. They take the political heat while good ideas can be continued by people who don't have to deal with the stress and the judgment that comes along with trying to do something interesting. Now, this is very old. I want to bring us an example far more relevant to you. So I'm going to show you a picture of a prototype. A prototype for an invention that's one of the most important inventions in the history of computing. History of engineering, but also history of computing. So I'm going to show it to you, take a look at it just for a second, and I'll ask you a question about it. Does anyone know what this is a prototype of? I want to take a guess. Transistor, keyboard, getting warmer. Morse code, not as close. Mouse, very good. So Ronnie told me that I should expect a very smart audience. So as preparing for that, I cheated a little bit. This is actually upside down. This is now right side up. The white blob on the bottom is a human knee. It's a person's knee. So this is a human-computer interaction device. Doug Engelbart, who deserves credit for inventing the mouse, was working in the 1960s trying to figure out how do humans and computers interact? What's the best way to do that? And some of the metaphors at that time, 1960s, there weren't that many metaphors. Some of them involved other limbs. Driving cars, which were popular by this time. You have your arms, you also use your limbs, use your feet. Sewing machines, same thing. You have a foot pedal. So he was thinking, how can people interact with machines in a useful way? This, to me, is an example of an abandoned idea that you'd only know by studying the history of a problem that I bet will resurface. We're so obsessed with productivity, you can make the argument we are 50% limb optimized today. You only use 2 hands. You got 2 feet. They should be doing something, right? More output. I'm sure there's a startup somewhere that is working on that right now. But more to my point, if I showed you a more modern-looking prototype, okay, but yeah, I can see it. That's kind of like a mouse. It's wood, which is a little strange. But yeah, I can see how it's a mouse. But again, remember, 1970. If you saw this in 1970 and someone said, this is the future of computing or the future of human interaction with computing, in 1970, you'd be like, the future of what? Computers are these big spinning tape drives that are in the basements. There's punch cards. Human-computer interaction. Computers are not something most humans would ever interact with. You'd see this and think it was really weird. Weird and bad are not the same. Now the lesson, one way to frame this lesson, I've offered you 2 stories about great ideas or great masterpiece works. Eiffel Tower, the computer mouse. I'd call them masterpieces, at least in terms of their impact on the world, the engineering world, our notion of ideas. They both started as kinds of experiments. And my claim to you is that all masterpieces start that way. They all start weird. They all start strange. They all start in clunky, weird, awkward-looking forms. And it takes a different evaluation method to see the value of these things. The specific recommendation I would offer to you, since you are working with ideas every day, every email you get, every spec you read, every conversation you have, there are ideas and they're floating around. And we tend to just, good ideas and bad ideas, good ideas and bad ideas. I am legitimately recommending to you, you have some place, you have the good folder on your desktop, the bad idea folder, or maybe the wastebasket, trash can, and you have a weird idea folder. Have a place you have set aside that when you're in a conversation, someone proposes something, you're like, that's really weird. Normally, you would say that means it's bad and throw it away. I'm telling you now, that's really weird. Maybe this could be used for something I haven't come across yet. There's something interesting about this idea, and I don't know what it is yet. I'm going to put this in my weird pile. And your weird pile is something every now and then, when you're bored or you're stuck on a different problem, go to your weird pile. Every inventor, every engineer, every writer, of which I am one, every artist, has a weird pile. They might call it a journal. They might call it a scrapbook. They might call it like the pile of junk in their lab. They have a weird pile. A weird pile is an asset. It allows you the opportunity When you see an idea pitched to you for the first time, we judge it instantly based on one dimension of a point of view. But it could be that it's only the third time or the fourth time, or maybe I hold it up this way, or look at it far away, or look at it really close. It may be in the fourth time you question an idea, the fifth time that it starts to open up and you see the uses for it. I gave you two examples, and I am promising you that almost every story you know of a legendary idea you probably believe landed in someone's mind in perfection has an experimental history like the one I am offering to you. My third lesson to you, I only two more, and the pace will pick up, is that our minds are naturally creative. I've avoided using the word creative thinking for the most part in this talk, even though that's really what the talk is about, because creativity has a weird notion. The notion is about novelty. That guy's so creative, that woman's so creative. Usually what we're referring to, that their idea seems original. That's really not that useful kind of creativity. I think of creativity as the ability to solve problems. There's a difficult problem people are stuck on. If you can find a solution for it, that to me is creative thinking. You're applying an idea in a way that other people couldn't to solve a problem. So when I think about creative thinking this way, the word creative fades away. It's really just being good at thinking. If I asked you the capital of Washington State and you told me it's Olympia, that's a very rote kind of thinking. You're not really solving a problem. But if I asked you to figure out where would the best place be today if we had to re-establish a capital, how would you go about solving that problem? I'd call that a kind of thinking, creative thinking. I don't really care as long as you solve the problem. Now, with that in mind, I can tell you that it's clear all of us are good at creative thinking. It is our species' most powerful gift, the ability to solve problems. And to illustrate this, I'm going to tell you an anecdote that comes from all of our ordinary lives. Keys are important. It's how you get into your car. It's how you get into your house. It's a scary thing when you lose your keys. So imagine the hypothesis, this scenario that all of us have experienced. Let's say it's Monday morning. You had a nice weekend. Monday morning, you wake up to go to work, and you have a routine we all do before you go to the airlock out into the world. You shower, shave, prune, whatever you do. You go to the door, you pre-airlock check. Where's my wallet or my purse? Do I have my phone? Do I have my keys? Let's say in this morning, keys are not there. We have routines. You go to whatever your receptacle is for your keys. For me, it's a basket by the door. Go to the basket, look in the basket. Often they're there. If they're not there, my brain automatically goes to level 2. Oh, they're usually in the basket, so maybe they fell behind the basket. Okay, I slide the basket over, I look around. Not there. My brain goes to level 3. It's going through ideas in the most likely probability that they're true, but we're getting increasingly less probable now. I've looked behind it. My basket's on a shelf, so I look behind the shelf. Now my brain has exhausted the 3 most probable solutions. My brain starts getting creative now. I go to my closet, look in the jacket. Was I wearing the jacket? I'm not sure. I think I was wearing the jacket, right. Which pocket? I don't know. Left pocket, right pocket. Don't know. Now I'm at option 4, option 5. My brain's starting to get really creative now. I'm going to look in clothes I know I haven't worn recently. I know I haven't worn. Why am I looking? Well, it wasn't in other places. I got to be creative. Your brain has to be creative now. I may go outside and walk from my car to my house. Maybe they fell out. Maybe. Increasingly low probability options enter my mind and enter your mind. You may even go back to your basket and look to see if the keys have reappeared since you've been looking around. Somehow the laws of physics have changed, and you can go back and get your keys now. So what is that? To me, that is natural creativity. You have a problem that's important to solve. You need to get to work. Ordinary solutions are not working. You go to the non-ordinary, the creative, the lower probability. And you do it without thinking. You do it without an ideation exercise. You do it without a brainstorming technique. You do it without reading a book on creativity. Your brain just does it. That's what we do. That's what we are good at. To make this into a useful quote, when sufficiently motivated by a hard problem, creativity is unavoidable. You will do it, whether you want to or not. The question is, do you enjoy it? The question is, do you find it interesting? And for most people who are called creative, they find it interesting. They like to explore these sorts of problems. They like the idea that they have to go through, I get to try this, what about that? They're curious. And most people who say, I'm not that creative, It really means they just don't like that feeling of the unknown. They don't enjoy it, but they're capable of it, just like all of us are capable of doing ridiculous things in this pursuit of our keys. There is a phrase that I hate called think outside the box. How many of you have heard this phrase at work in the last month? Raise your hand. Not that many. You're lying. Really? That's fantastic. Okay. How many of you hate the phrase then, or don't like the phrase? Okay. So this is where that phrase comes from. Now, all of you heard the phrase, right? I don't want to waste your time here. You've all heard the phrase. It comes from this puzzle. This is called the 9 dots puzzle. In the 1970s, there was a consultant who popularized this puzzle with the phrase, think outside the box. The puzzle is very old, much older than the consultant, but he reframed it in this way. He thought this was a useful way to teach people creativity. I think it's terrible. Let me talk about the puzzle, and then I'll tell you why it's terrible. So the puzzle has a very simple instruction. On a piece of paper, that's how this is usually offered. There's 9 dots. You have to connect them using only straight lines, and you can't lift your pen or pencil. So the only way you can solve the problem, at least one of those lines has to go outside the box. And so think outside the box is meant to be, what it's meant to tell you is that there's artificial constraints that are getting in your way. That's what it's meant to tell you. And if you remove those constraints, you will be able to solve problems. My critique of that phrase is usually when it's used, you're in a meeting, trying to solve a problem. Someone gets frustrated with the poor quality solutions and says, come on, everybody, think outside the box. Now, if that person who utters that phrase was so good at creative thinking, they would offer a solution. To say think outside the box is basically saying, come on, everybody, be smarter, which is just useless. It doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't help anybody. But the notion of constraints is useful. So if you take that notion to this puzzle and go a little bit further, there should be many, many solutions to this. If all we have to do is eliminate constraints, well, if you go really far outside the box, you can do it in 3 lines. If you ask the question, wait a second, what's a line? A line is an abstract idea. You can do it in 1 line. It could be any width. Doesn't say how wide the pen is. On and on you can go with different solutions. Lines are an abstract idea, abstract geometric construct. And then, of course, you have the origami solution. On and on it goes. And depending on how ridiculous and silly you're willing to be, what constraints you're willing to, there should be a million, infinite number of solutions. To make this practical, this is the practical way to take all this and use it. If you remove false constraints, new thinking paths will open up to you. Now, part of the thing about constraints, I'll explain this a little more in a second. Part of the thing about constraints, the psychology behind it, is as human beings are social creatures. We are social creatures. We depend on not killing each other to survive. We have to get along. We have families and tribes and cities and towns and countries and nations, etc. Most of our lives, we function with each other because we're good at assuming constraints. None of you came into this room and decided, you know what, I'm going to stand on stage today. I don't care if there's a speaker. I'm just going to sit here and I'll do that. None of you are standing up and making phone calls. I have constraints. No one told me that I couldn't go and sit in the front row and talk from here. It's very strange, but no one told me that I couldn't do it. It'd be really funny right now if someone walked in the room and they're like, what is going on? False constraints. Where's the speaker? What's going on? Most of life, we automatically apply constraints. That's a good thing. That's how we're able to drive on highways and not kill each other most of the time. But where those constraints, our ability to project constraints is a problem is when you're trying to solve hard problems. We preload and put those constraints in, and that's what think outside the box in the puzzle is really all about. So what does this mean then? If you remove false constraints, new paths open up. This is very powerful, especially for people who don't feel they are creative. This is deductive logic. This is removing things. It's not induction. You're not creating something out of the blue. If you have a problem you're trying to solve and you're stuck, you can go to your whiteboard and say, what are my constraints? Has to be done by Friday. Has to use only this much memory, has to use this API set, whatever your constraints are, you can at any time go to your whiteboard and write them down. And once you see the constraints, you can stand back and go, well, which of these has some room? Which of these could I eliminate? And if you work on a team, it's even more powerful. Everyone in the room, when you're stuck, is making constraints. That's why you're stuck. If you can identify those constraints and talk about them, there could be room for other possibilities. The most obvious one, if I think the deadline is Friday, I'm limiting my solutions based on that assumption. But if I put that on the whiteboard and my teammate says, no, our boss is out of town until Tuesday. We have plenty of time. Maybe we have to work a little bit on the weekends. Maybe we have to come in early on Monday. But the constraint now is not there, which means now there's more room to consider other ideas. It's deductive logic that leads you to that path. Another problem with constraints or challenge with constraints is also cultural. It has to do with the culture of the organization, the people that you work with. There's this notion of idea killers in cultures. Phrases that people say that have very little logical substance that end conversations about new ideas. The most popular and pervasive in most cultures, even innovation-centric or companies that claim to be innovation-centric, we tried that before. We tried that before is a logical fallacy. If you come to me and say, I got this idea for the tallest tower in the world, no, we tried that before, it doesn't work. When I say we tried that before, that says nothing about how we tried it. It could have been when we tried that before, it was a team of drunken monkeys that were lost in the dark, working on MS-DOS computers trying to solve the problem. We tried that before. We tried it before. Not a good way for anyone to end a conversation about an idea. And if you hear someone say that to you, the question to ask, don't let that end the conversation. Say, yes, we tried that before, but now we're smarter. Now we have this toolkit. Now we know X, we know Y. Now we have this resource. Now it's worth trying it again. That's a way to bring the conversation back into the world. Now, as a manager, a former manager, we tried that before. It's just a quick way to kill conversations that are annoying me. Sometimes you have so many people coming to you with ideas, you need to kill some of them quickly. That's why people use these. But in an environment where you're supposed to be creative, you're supposed to be progressive, you want to hear these phrases as little as possible. They are artificial constraints that deny the possibility of progress for ideas. That was my last lesson for you. This is the razzle-dazzle book cover slide. Many of you are now in possession of this book. Most of the stories I have told you, there are different stories in the book. The lessons are similar, but you'll enjoy the book. It's a different contrast to how I share these ideas with you. As a summary, these are the 4 main lessons that I offered you. If you want a link to these slides, they're up online right now, bit.ly/OA-Berkun. All ideas are made from other ideas. Great ideas look weird at first. Eiffel Tower, remember, people made fun of it. It wasn't done yet. Weird is not the same as bad. Have a weird folder. We're naturally creative. When you feel stuck, think of your card keys. You always want to try crazy ideas for your card keys. You can apply the same process to any problem you feel stuck on. And lastly, false constraints. I won't say the phrase, think outside the box, though I realize I just did. Eliminate false constraints. When you're stuck on a team project, ask the question, wait, what false constraints have we not recognized? That if we call them out, we can make progress happen. I will be around today. I'll be around at lunch if you want to ask me questions. You want to challenge me on some of these things, or you have a mythological legend about creative thinking and how it works. You want to ask me about it. I'm an expert on those subjects. I'm happy to chat with you and talk with you. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.